Billionaire arrived at his company party proud, until his ex showed up holding his newborn twins. Roy Reaves stood in the center of the grand ballroom, the spotlight fixed on him as glasses clinked and applause filled the air. His company had just celebrated a record-breaking year, and he carried himself with the pride of a man who believed nothing could shake him. Reporters snapped photos, investors whispered his name with admiration, and the band at the Rainbow Room in Manhattan played softly in the background. Then, the crowd fell silent. A woman had stepped through the doors, her coat worn from use, her shoes tired from miles of walking. In front of her was a stroller carrying 2 newborn babies. Her eyes were locked on Roy, steady and unshaken. Gasps spread across the hall as whispers rose among the guests. Ruth Emma moved closer, the soft cries of the twins echoing faintly in the glittering hall. She stopped just a few feet from Roy, her voice clear and firm. "These are your children, Roy." The cameras stopped clicking. Investors froze mid-sentence. The entire party stood still, waiting for his response. Roy's confident smile disappeared, and for the first time all night, he had no words. Roy Reaves was known across New York City as the man who had built an empire from almost nothing. Born in Akron, Ohio, Roy grew up in a small home where his father worked long shifts at a steel plant and his mother took on part-time jobs to keep food on the table. He carried those memories with him through every stage of his life. The smell of grease on his father's clothes, the weight of overdue bills stacked on the kitchen counter, the quiet worry that seemed to hang over his childhood. Those early years created a hunger in him. By the time he was a teenager, he was already thinking about how to break free from the limits of his background. At 18, he left Ohio with a scholarship to New York University, determined never to return to the same struggles his parents faced. The city overwhelmed him at first, the speed of Times Square, the chaos of the subway, the feeling that everyone was chasing something. But instead of shrinking back, Roy pushed forward. After graduating, he started working on Wall Street. Long nights, endless coffee, and countless mistakes filled his early career, but Roy was relentless. He didn't have family money or connections, but he had a mind for numbers and an ability to convince people to believe in his ideas. Within a decade, he launched his own investment firm. What began in a cramped office in Lower Manhattan grew into a billion-dollar powerhouse with branches in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Miami. Roy's rise wasn't just about business. He became a symbol. The press called him the Midwest boy who conquered Wall Street. His photo appeared on the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. He owned a penthouse in Tribeca with a view stretching toward the Hudson River. He drove through Manhattan in luxury cars, but always made sure reporters caught him smiling with employees or shaking hands at charity events. He understood image, and he worked hard to make sure his story inspired admiration. That night at the Rainbow Room, his sense of pride was at its peak. The gala was more than a party. It was a statement. The ballroom's glass windows revealed the Manhattan skyline glowing against the September night. Guests included CEOs, senators, celebrities, and investors who had flown in from across the country. A jazz band filled the air with music as servers moved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Every detail had been carefully planned, from the decor in the company's colors to the speeches praising Roy's leadership. Standing on the stage, he smiled as the crowd cheered. His company had doubled its profits in a single year, and the stock price had reached record highs. Employees spoke of him as a visionary, someone who had carried them to success through bold decisions. He looked out at the room and saw nothing but approval. To Roy, it felt like the world finally recognized him, not as the poor boy from Ohio, but as a man who had written his own destiny. In that moment, Roy was untouchable, or so he thought. The pride in his chest was heavy, almost blinding. He believed his story had no cracks, that the life he had built could not be challenged. He had convinced himself that every sacrifice, every relationship left behind, every choice to put work before people, was worth it. Tonight was the proof. But fate had a way of entering uninvited. While Roy stood before his peers, soaking in their applause, the doors of the ballroom opened quietly. The room that had been filled with laughter and music shifted into stillness as someone unexpected crossed the floor. Roy had faced hostile markets, competitive rivals, and ruthless boardrooms, but nothing in his years of success prepared him for what was about to stand in front of him. Ruth Emma's world could not have been more different from Roy's. While he stood at the top of skyscrapers in Manhattan, she lived in a small walk-up apartment in Brooklyn. The paint on the walls was chipped, the pipes sometimes rattled, and the windows let in more cold air than they kept out in winter. But it was home, and Ruth worked hard to keep it warm and safe. She had always been steady, the kind of person people trusted. After finishing nursing school, she found work at a local hospital in Flatbush. The shifts were long, often stretching into late nights, but Ruth carried herself with quiet strength. Her co-workers admired her patience with patients who had no one else to sit with them. She often skipped breaks to stay by a bedside, holding a hand or calming someone's fear. Her life had not been free of dreams. Years earlier, she had met Roy when he was still building his career. They crossed paths at a friend's gathering in New York. He was ambitious, sharp, and spoke with a confidence that drew people in. Ruth was cautious but curious. For a short while, they built a relationship that seemed full of promise. She believed in him when he said he was chasing something bigger, and she admired his drive. But Roy's attention was split. The more his business grew, the less time he gave to her. Meetings replaced dinners, phone calls were cut short, and his promises often faded into silence. When Ruth discovered she was pregnant, she hoped it would bring them closer. Instead, Roy's response was distance. He told her his focus was on the company, that he wasn't ready for a family. His words left her with no doubt. She would be facing motherhood alone. Ruth made her choice. She refused to let rejection break her. She kept working through her pregnancy, saving every dollar she could. Neighbors helped when they could, dropping off meals or offering to run errands. Still, most nights, Ruth sat alone with her thoughts, her hands resting on her growing stomach, reminding herself that her children would be her reason to keep going. When the twins, Noah and June, were born, her life shifted completely. The sleepless nights, the medical bills, and the constant balancing act between work and motherhood tested her every day. Yet, when she looked at their small faces, she felt a strength she had never known before. Each cry in the night reminded her that she had someone to fight for. Money was tight. She cut back on everything that wasn't essential. Second-hand clothes, borrowed strollers, and budget meals became routine. Still, Ruth made sure her children never felt unwanted. She sang to them softly after long shifts, carried them through city streets with determination, and refused to let her struggles define them. What hurt most wasn't the hardship. It was knowing that Roy, the father of her children, continued to rise higher without ever reaching back. She saw his name on magazine covers, read about his deals, and sometimes caught glimpses of his interviews on TV. The man she once trusted had built an empire, while she was counting coins to buy diapers. Yet, she did not let bitterness consume her. She focused on Noah and June. Ruth never planned to appear at his gala. But when she received a formal notice in the mail, addressed to employees and family guests, she paused. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Then she considered what it meant. For years, Roy had been absent, acting as if his children did not exist. This invitation, however unintentional, felt like a door. She debated with herself for days, unsure if she had the courage. Finally, one evening, as she rocked Noah to sleep and June rested against her shoulder, she made her decision. She would go. Not to beg, not to shame, but to show Roy the truth he had ignored. Her children deserved to be seen. The night of the gala, Ruth walked through Brooklyn streets to the subway, the stroller rattling on uneven sidewalks. Fellow passengers glanced curiously at her and the twins as she rode into Manhattan. She kept her head high, even as doubts filled her mind. Could she really step into his world, surrounded by wealth and influence, and stand firm? When she reached the Rainbow Room, she hesitated at the doors. Through the glass, she could see the glow of chandeliers, the shimmer of gowns, the polished shoes of powerful men. She adjusted the blanket around her twins and whispered to them softly. Then she pushed forward. The moment she entered, silence spread. Whispers rippled through the crowd as she made her way across the polished floor. She was no longer the woman left behind. She was a mother, standing with courage, ready to speak the truth Roy had spent years avoiding. The ballroom was alive with chatter just moments before Ruth arrived. Guests were laughing, servers carried trays of champagne, and the band's music filled the air. But as the doors opened, a sudden hush fell across the room. Heads turned in unison. Ruth stepped forward, pushing the stroller. Her coat was simple, her step steady. Every movement carried weight. The twins stirred softly, one letting out a small cry that carried far louder in the silence than anyone expected. Conversations stopped. Glasses were lowered. A few gasps slipped through the crowd. Roy froze on stage. At first, he thought he was seeing a stranger, someone who had stumbled into the event by mistake. But as Ruth's face came into view, recognition hit him. His chest tightened, and the smile he had worn so easily all evening disappeared. Cameras that had been flashing moments earlier now pointed toward Ruth. Reporters whispered to one another, sensing a story in the making. Investors craned their necks, confused by the sudden change in atmosphere. Ruth stopped just a few feet from the stage. Her eyes met Roy's, unwavering. The years of struggle, the nights of exhaustion, and the resilience she had built were written across her expression. She spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "These are your children, Roy." The words dropped like a stone into still water. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, Roy could not respond. His carefully built world of confidence and control slipped. His throat tightened, but no sound came out. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some glanced at one another, others at Roy, waiting for him to say something. Finally, Roy stepped down from the stage. His polished shoes echoed against the floor as he crossed the distance between them. Every step felt heavier than the last. Guests leaned forward, desperate to catch his reaction. When he reached her, he lowered his voice so only she could hear. "Ruth, what are you doing here?" Her reply was calm but firm. "They deserve to be seen, Roy. You can't hide from this forever." He glanced at the stroller, his jaw tightening. The sight of the two tiny faces unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. For years, he had buried the thought of children, convincing himself that his career justified everything he had left behind. Now, in front of hundreds of eyes, that choice had returned to him in its most undeniable form. Around them, the crowd murmured. Some whispered about scandal. Others pulled out phones, capturing the moment despite the staff's attempts to stop them. Investors who once cheered his name now exchanged worried looks. Roy straightened, his mind racing. His empire depended on strength, on control, on never showing weakness. Yet here, standing in front of Ruth and the twins, strength suddenly felt different. It wasn't about numbers or headlines. It was about responsibility he had ignored. He leaned closer again. "We shouldn't do this here." Ruth's eyes didn't waver. "I didn't come to embarrass you. I came because they deserve a father." The firmness in her tone left him shaken. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but words failed him. For the first time that night, Roy Reaves, the man who had always known how to command a room, was silent. The band had stopped playing. The applause that once filled the hall seemed like a distant memory. All that remained was the quiet hum of whispers and the undeniable reality standing in front of him. Roy finally turned toward the crowd, forcing a tight smile, but the damage was done. The perfect image he had carried into the gala was no longer intact. The evening that was supposed to mark his greatest triumph had shifted into something far more personal and far more complicated. The staff quickly guided the guests back to their seats, but the tension in the ballroom didn't fade. Conversations were hushed. Eyes kept drifting toward Ruth and the stroller. Everyone wanted to know what Roy would do next. Roy motioned for his assistant to cover for him, then quietly led Ruth toward a side corridor away from the main hall. The walls here were lined with framed photographs of past galas and company milestones, reminders of how much he had built. For once, those reminders felt small compared to the woman standing in front of him, holding the truth he had tried to push aside. Ruth parked the stroller gently against the wall, making sure the twins were comfortable. She crossed her arms, her eyes steady on Roy. He rubbed the back of his neck, his confidence stripped away. "You shouldn't have come here like this," Roy said at last, his voice low. Her reply was measured. "I tried calling you, Roy. I tried sending messages. You were too busy to answer. You made it clear where your priorities were." He looked down at the twins. Tiny faces, barely a few weeks old, innocent and unaware of the storm around them. He swallowed hard. "I didn't know. I thought you would." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "You thought I would take care of it alone?" Ruth asked, her tone sharp but not cruel. "You thought I would raise them in silence while you stood on stages and gave speeches about vision and leadership?" Roy's chest tightened. He had faced boardroom battles, lawsuits, and high-stakes negotiations, but nothing left him as unsteady as this. "It wasn't like that," he said weakly. "Then what was it like?" Ruth asked, stepping closer. "Because from where I stand, I carried these children, I gave birth to them, and I've been the one waking up every night while you lived like none of this existed." Her words struck deeper than any critic's column ever could. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but deep down, he knew she was right. The twins stirred in the stroller. Ruth bent down, adjusting the blanket, her movements tender. Roy watched her, guilt pressing heavier with every passing second. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said finally. "You didn't think about what I wanted," Ruth replied softly, still looking at the babies. "You thought about yourself. That's the truth." He sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair that now looked undone. "Ruth, I don't even know where to start." "You start by looking at them," she said, pointing to the twins. "Not as a problem, not as an inconvenience, but as your children." Roy stepped closer to the stroller. For the first time, he let himself look at them, really look. Tiny hands, delicate faces, breaths so soft they were barely audible. One of them shifted and let out a small sound, and it made his chest ache in a way that no business success ever had. "They're mine," he whispered. "Yes," Ruth said, her voice firm. They're yours. And they deserve more than your silence. The weight of her words hung heavy between them. Roy's mind raced. 4 years, he had measured success in profits, headlines, and recognition. But now, standing here, the definition of success seemed to shift. "I don't know if I can be the father they need," he admitted quietly. "You don't have to know everything right now," Ruth said. "You just have to show up. That's more than you've done so far." Her calmness surprised him. She wasn't here to ruin him, wasn't here for revenge. She was here because the twins deserved acknowledgement. That realization made his throat tighten. "I'll take the test," he said, his voice steadying. "If that's what you want, I'll take the paternity test. And if they're mine," he paused, correcting himself, "when they're confirmed as mine, I'll do what I should have done from the beginning." Ruth studied him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to believe him. Finally, she nodded. "It's not about me, Roy. It's about them. They didn't ask for any of this." He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "You're right. I'll fix this. I don't know how yet, but I will." Ruth turned back to the twins, her voice softening. "Good. Because they need more than promises. They need presence." For the first time all evening, Roy didn't feel like the billionaire who had conquered Wall Street. He felt like a man standing at a crossroads, faced with the kind of decision that couldn't be delegated, negotiated, or spun by PR. This was about responsibility, about humanity, about finally stepping into a role he had avoided for too long. In the distance, the sound of the gala slowly picked back up, but for Roy, the noise faded into the background. In this quiet corridor, surrounded by reminders of his empire, he realized that none of it mattered if he failed at the most basic role life had given him: being a father. The news of Ruth Emma showing up at the party with newborn twins spread through New York's corporate circles faster than Roy Reaves could have prepared for. In less than 24 hours, gossip outlets, business columns, and even mainstream news carried headlines that questioned not only his character but the stability of his billion-dollar empire. In the marble-lined hallways of Reaves' global headquarters near Wall Street, board members gathered for an emergency meeting. Investors were nervous. Several spoke bluntly. Shareholders worried that the scandal would damage the company's reputation, dragging stock value down. Questions hung in the air. Was Roy a reckless leader? Did his private life signal distractions that might bleed into corporate decisions? Roy sat at the head of the long mahogany boardroom table, not as confident as he usually appeared. For the first time in years, silence from him felt heavier than his speeches. He knew his empire's strength was tied to his name, and his name was now on every headline in ways he never expected. The conversation turned sharp when a senior partner warned, "Public trust fuels our stock price. If people doubt your integrity, they will doubt our brand." The room was tense, filled with men and women who had built their careers under Roy's leadership but were now questioning his judgment. Yet Roy refused to deflect responsibility. He asked for a short recess, excused himself, and walked to the side office where his attorney and physician were waiting. He had already decided there would be no more delays. He would take a paternity test. The test result arrived 2 weeks later, delivered privately to his penthouse overlooking Central Park. He opened the envelope alone. The confirmation was undeniable. He was the father of both Noah and June. The weight of the truth pressed on him differently than he had imagined. Instead of shame, he felt something sharper: responsibility. For years, he had measured his success in quarterly earnings and skyscrapers bearing his company's logo. Now, 2 tiny lives connected him to a future that no stock portfolio could secure. When the news reached the board, It shook the company again. Some feared this would cement the scandal. Others believed it could become a turning point if handled with humility. Roy, for the first time in his career, did something he had never done. He stepped back. He announced that certain responsibilities would be delegated to trusted executives so he could focus on personal accountability. His decision was met with disbelief by some, but it was genuine. For years, Roy had been called untouchable. Now he wanted to be touchable, not by critics, but by the children who bore his name. The transition wasn't smooth. At first, Roy struggled with the basics of fatherhood. He had never held a baby bottle, never understood the rhythm of a midnight feeding, never realized how fragile an infant's breath sounded in the quiet of the night. Ruth watched with guarded eyes, unsure if his effort was permanent or performative. In private moments, he wrestled with the demands of leadership versus the demands of fatherhood. Late nights once spent reviewing contracts were now interrupted by the cries of Noah or June. The man who once commanded Wall Street meetings with flawless control now found himself fumbling with diaper straps in a modest Brooklyn apartment where Ruth lived. It humbled him, but it also reshaped him. The empire he had built suddenly looked incomplete if his children grew up strangers to him. The media captured every move. Photos of Roy leaving Ruth's apartment with a stroller circulated online. Critics debated whether it was genuine or staged for image repair. But those closest to him saw the change. He wasn't chasing cameras. He was chasing time he had already lost. For Roy, the greatest struggle wasn't the headlines or the corporate pressure. It was unlearning the habit of pride. For decades, he had lived with walls built high around his life. Now, in the soft cries of his newborns, those walls were breaking brick by brick. While Roy wrestled with his new reality, Ruth Emma carried a different weight. She had raised the twins alone for months, steadying herself with quiet determination. Her life was a constant balance between work, sleepless nights, and the demands of two newborns. Now, with Roy stepping into the picture, she faced both relief and uncertainty. Ruth lived in Brooklyn, not far from Prospect Park. Her apartment was small but filled with warmth, walls painted in calming shades, second-hand furniture carefully arranged, and baby toys scattered across the living room floor. She had no chauffeur, no corporate jet, no doorman greeting her at the entrance. Her world was ordinary, but it was hers, and she had learned to survive without leaning on anyone. When Roy showed up, offering support, Ruth did not fold into his wealth. She stayed cautious. She knew what it meant to be overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated by him years ago. The arrival of help was not enough to erase the memories of those lonely months when she faced motherhood alone. Still, the twins were the priority. Noah and June became the bridge between them. Their needs forced cooperation. Ruth and Roy found themselves negotiating everything, from doctor visits at NYU Langone to deciding whether the twins should be introduced to Roy's extended family in Manhattan. There were disagreements. Ruth preferred a grounded approach, raising them in a community where neighbors knew their names. Roy leaned toward privilege, wanting private healthcare specialists and exclusive schools lined up even before the twins turned one. Heated conversations followed, sometimes ending with Ruth walking into the bedroom and closing the door while Roy stood in the kitchen, frustrated but unwilling to storm out. But there were small victories, too. One afternoon in Prospect Park, while Ruth pushed the stroller and Roy walked beside her holding diaper bags awkwardly slung over his shoulder, they found themselves laughing together. It wasn't romantic, but it was real. Two people discovering that cooperation didn't always have to feel like combat. The twins themselves became the strongest teachers. Noah's soft giggle or June's curious stare reminded them both that parenting wasn't about ego. It was about showing up, again and again, even when tired, even when unsure. As the months passed, Ruth began to notice something unexpected. Roy no longer spoke to her as though she were invisible. He asked her opinion, listened when she spoke, and adjusted when she insisted on boundaries. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. For the first time, Ruth felt that her dignity was not up for negotiation. Friends in Brooklyn noticed the change too. Neighbors who had once seen her as the woman abandoned by a powerful man now saw her as someone who commanded respect. She had not begged for Roy's help, and yet he had shown up. That shift didn't just restore her confidence, it multiplied it. Ruth returned to part-time work at a non-profit office near downtown Brooklyn, managing community programs for mothers in need. Her colleagues admired her quiet strength. She never bragged about her connection to Roy, nor did she hide it. She simply focused on her responsibilities and made sure her children were cared for. The relationship between her independence and Roy's presence created a delicate balance. Ruth wasn't seeking luxury, nor was she closing the door to Roy's help. She accepted what was necessary for the twins, but refused to surrender her hard-earned identity. She had once been invisible in Roy's world of skyscrapers and boardrooms. Now she stood eye to eye with him, not as an accessory to his image, but as the mother of his children and as a woman who had rebuilt her own life. Noah and June grew quickly, marking milestones that stitched new rhythms into Ruth's days. Their first words, their wobbly first steps, their giggles echoing through the small apartment, all became reminders that resilience carried rewards. Each moment told Ruth that survival had been worth it, and that dignity could outlast neglect. For Ruth, the adjustment wasn't about stepping into Roy's shadow, but learning how to co-parent without losing herself. She discovered that independence and collaboration could exist side by side, as long as she stayed rooted in her values. Once the paternity test became public knowledge, media outlets from the New York Times to entertainment blogs lit up with debates. Cable news hosts on networks like CNN and Fox Business ran panels discussing what the revelation meant for corporate accountability. Some argued that Roy Reaves had failed as a role model, while others claimed his decision to step back from certain company duties proved he was maturing. Headlines swung between criticism and cautious approval. Billionaire caught off guard, now faces real fatherhood. Roy Reaves, scandal or second chance? Morning talk shows invited parenting experts to weigh in. Was it too late for Roy to repair his image? Could a billionaire CEO genuinely balance diapers and boardrooms? For weeks, his name became less about Wall Street deals and more about domestic responsibility. Meanwhile, Ruth felt the ripple effects on a personal level. At the grocery store in Brooklyn, neighbors greeted her differently. Instead of hushed whispers, there were nods of respect. "You're doing great," one elderly woman told her outside a bodega. At the local park, parents she barely knew offered help, bringing extra formula or babysitting for an hour so Ruth could rest. This ordinary kindness meant more than the headlines. It reminded Ruth that while national media dissected her life, her community still saw her as a mother doing her best. Inside the corporate world, Roy's transformation was harder to digest. Board members who had once admired his untouchable persona now had to adjust to a leader who admitted vulnerability. In private meetings, Roy no longer pretended everything was fine. He acknowledged his mistakes, something that shocked colleagues who were used to his flawless control. Gradually, public perception began to shift. Instead of seeing Roy only as the arrogant CEO who was caught off guard, people started to see him as a man learning in real time. Photos of him walking into a pediatric clinic in Queens or holding both twins outside Ruth's apartment appeared online, not as staged publicity shots but as glimpses of authenticity. Not everyone approved. Certain critics dismissed his effort as damage control, accusing him of trying to polish his image to protect stock value. But over time, stories began to emerge from those who interacted with him directly. A nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital shared anonymously that Roy attended every checkup for the twins, quietly sitting in waiting rooms with other parents, refusing special treatment. This narrative slowly humanized him. He was no longer just the man on the Forbes cover. He was a father figuring things out. For Ruth, the shift was equally important. Once dismissed as a forgotten ex, she now stood as the mother who held her ground, earning respect both publicly and privately. Reporters tried to interview her, but she kept her answers simple. She wasn't chasing attention. She was raising children. By the time Noah and June celebrated their first birthday, the conversation in the press had moved from scandal to growth. Talk shows framed it as a story about responsibility rather than disgrace. "It's rare," one commentator said, "to see a man of his wealth and stature admit fault and actually show up daily. That's where the story really lies." The twins, without knowing it, had changed the way both parents were seen. They became symbols not of scandal but of second chances. As the noise of media debates faded and the first chaotic year of parenting passed, a clearer picture emerged. Roy Reaves and Ruth Emma were no longer just a headline. They were two people navigating responsibility, learning to respect each other, and raising twins who symbolized both consequence and hope. The story carried lessons far beyond Wall Street, Brooklyn, or even New York. It became an example of how public figures and ordinary people can stumble, recover, and grow. Roy had spent his adult life perfecting his image. The boardroom suits, the magazine covers, the carefully staged interviews all created the illusion of control. But when Ruth walked into that company party holding Noah and June, no amount of branding could protect him. What mattered wasn't the gloss of image but the substance of responsibility. Viewers could see that while reputation can crumble overnight, responsibility has to be lived day after day. Apologies were never enough. Roy had to show up to pediatric visits, to late-night feedings, to moments when he would rather be at a corporate retreat in Los Angeles or Miami. Accountability wasn't about press statements. It was about carrying diaper bags through Prospect Park, about making space in his life for the twins. For the audience, this underscored a truth. Responsibility requires proof, not promises. Ruth never begged the media for attention, nor did she use the scandal to chase sympathy. She raised her children with steady strength and demanded respect through her actions. Her dignity turned out to be more powerful than any spectacle at the company party. Viewers could learn that sometimes the quiet strength of holding one's ground speaks louder than public drama. The most unexpected shift came not from billionaires or board members, but from ordinary people. Neighbors, co-workers, and strangers extended kindness because they saw Ruth and Roy in human terms. When leaders admit flaws, communities often respond with empathy. For the audience, the lesson was clear. Humanity bridges divides faster than pride ever can. Roy and Ruth didn't follow a fairy tale script. There was no sudden romance rekindled under the city lights. Instead, there was compromise, negotiation, and the slow building of trust. Families, whether wealthy or not, often require patience and constant dialogue. The story showed that there is no perfect formula, only effort and willingness. By the time Noah and June turned 2, they were growing up surrounded by love and responsibility. They had parents who didn't always agree, but who showed up anyway. They were raised not in a world of spectacle, but in a balance of independence and shared duty. For the audience, this wasn't just a story about a billionaire or a forgotten ex. It was a reminder that responsibility reshapes lives, that dignity commands respect, and that second chances matter, not because they erase the past, but because they build the future. As the final lesson settled, the story closed with a question for the viewers. What do you think? Did Roy do the right thing by stepping up, even if it was late? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Your support helps us bring you more inspiring stories like this.